Hey guys, thank you very much for signing up to my Patreon. It's really appreciated. As part of that subscription, you've now got access to my brushes, which you can download in this post. You can also download some custom shapes and my color palettes as well. I'll be going through those in a separate video. But this video is all about explaining to you how to import those brushes and then how you can use them and what you can use the specific brushes for. So I'm just going to go over here to this empty canvas. Just going to make sure I've got my brush selected and then right click here. And I'm just going to go to this little gear icon in the corner and go to import brushes, which is right there. And you can see in my brush set, I've got loads of different packs, but this is my own brush pack here, the Retro Mani brush pack. So you just select that and then click open, and that will then append here, which you can see it's added to this one. In Finder, I like to keep them all organized in the actual folder for Photoshop. To access that, I just go to the Go button here, hold Alt to access the library, click Library, go to Application Support, Adobe Photoshop, Presets, and then you can see there's a little brushes folder there. It's a little bit different to get to this on a PC, but you're still going through Application Support, I believe. But you just want to go to this brushes pack and then you can import it or just drag and drop the file that I've given from this post into here, and then you can just import it from there. But it really doesn't matter where you import it from, it's just nice to keep it stored somewhere familiar. Okay, so now that we've got those brushes installed, I'm just going to select a new layer here and I'm just going to demonstrate a few of the brushes for you. I usually like to use very few brushes, and so if I just go through some of the paintings I've created, which you might have seen, there's only very few brushes that have been used to create these paintings. That's simply because I don't like faffing around with too many brushes, and I like to get that painterly feel. I think with my sort of much older work, I was very much more precise and exact, and it wasn't enjoyable to make, and it was trying to make stuff looking a little bit more photorealistic, but it lacked that painterly feel. Whereas this, I much prefer having a bit more of an abstract slash impressionist sort of feel. And that's how I've created all of these, including the characters as well. Okay, so I'm going to right click and just select the brush. So the first one is the pencil sketcher. So the pencil sketcher is quite simply, and I would just recommend, by the way, that if you're going to use these brushes, you definitely use it with a tablet. I'm using the Huion tablet, but you can actually obviously get any type of tablet, the Wacom or whatever. As long as it's pressure sensitive, it'll work. So with this pencil sketcher first, I'm just going to go over to my color here. I'm going to set it to black. And you'll see also these settings at the top are all preset as well. So I'd leave these how they are. Obviously, when you get a bit more familiar with them, you can change them, but these settings work with the brushes that I've given. So the idea of the brush, this brush is to behave more like a pencil. So it sketches. And if I just go to 100% zoom here, you can see that actually it behaves a lot more like a pen. Sorry, not a pen. It behaves a lot more like a pencil. And so if I'm just sort of sketching away, I can do very sort of soft lines, and they build up over time to get a bit darker. If I hold it down, it'll do much darker, thicker lines as well. And I can use this to usually to sketch out whatever it is that I'm doing. And I'm very sketchy when I draw. I don't often do precise lines like this, which you can probably see my lines are very sort of jaggedy. I'm not as smooth with the pencil. And so I like to sketch a lot before I actually start to see a shape form. So here, if I'm doing a face, for instance, I like to keep sketching, and I like that sketchy sort of feel to it. And this pencil really does give me that sort of effect if that's what it is that I'm going for. So give that one a go, and I really like this one, often because I'm someone who likes to sketch at night. I have a little sketch pad by my bed, and I like to sketch sort of little ideas or faces, or just to sort of keep myself a little bit sharp with the art. And so I like bringing that into Photoshop and having a similar sort of experience when I'm sort of creating something on a digital way as well. Okay, so that's the pencil. If I just zoom in a little bit as well, you'll see that there's actually a texture to the edge of the pencil. Obviously, it's a little bit because we're going past 100%, so it's a little bit pixelated. But you can see the edges are sort of rough. There's a bit of noise in there, so it has that texture of a pencil. It's not your sort of traditional line like you would see with, for instance, if we just got the general hard round brush, or even this soft round brush here, and try to mimic it. You can see there's no real texture to it. Even if I made that quite hard, made the brush quite hard, you can see it's just sort of like there's no edge texture to it. Whereas with the pencil sketcher that I've done, which has got a preset size, you can see there's some texture to it and a bit of noise on there as well. So I've created that specifically for this, so I can get that kind of effect that I'm looking for. Okay, so that is the pencil sketcher. I'm just going to remove all of this stuff here. The next brush is the soft flat brush. And the purpose of this brush really is to create buildings. So if you have a look on this knife painting, for instance, that I've done here, or this one of the city that I've done here, you can see it's pretty much this brush just swiped over to create these buildings. And it's a way of me just really jotting down ideas very quickly and starting to see ideas form in a very sort of abstract way. But I start to see how these buildings start all to fit together, and I can do it very quickly rather than being very precise about it. I'm just going to demonstrate that to you now. So I'm just going to increase the size of this brush. Again, you can see the mode is on hard light. So it's 78% opacity, 75% flow. It's got an airbrush setting as well turned on. And this really allows it to have much more of a paintbrush type of feel to it. So I'm just going to set this to, let's say, look up a darker greyish blue colour. And you can see if I hold it down here, you can see it has a very much a paintbrush, sort of a flat brush sort of feel to it. That can create those kind of strokes. Now, I obviously use them for buildings, but you can use them for whatever you think might be appropriate. The way I'll do a building is I'll kind of make this quite large, in fact, and then just sort of make these sort of straight lines, and then just get that 3 dimension to the building here and there, and it gives me a kind of a shape to that building, and I can create a number of different buildings from that, just all built up on top of each other, different sizes, just different angles as well, just to sort of build up a sort of feeling of a metropolis, if you will. And over time, the more you sort of build, the more dense the city starts to look. And I can do these other little sort of smaller areas on top of the buildings for them to build up, and then these sort of antennas or aerials on top of the buildings to make it feel like there's quite a lot of buildings all sitting one on top of each other, as I've done in the other painting that I showed you. And then I can just sort of maybe just taper the ground off a little bit, do a bit of shadow there. And over time, this obviously builds up and you start to create more and more buildings that start to really come to life, actually. And I actually like to use it quite large as well to create these little defined lines here, if you can see. And the good thing about, remember, the paintbrush is you can hold it down with that airbrush setting and then have that painterly sort of effect to it as well. So it feels like the paint is built up there. And it's sort of, you're just sort of swiping the paint across the canvas, rather than being very digital about it, which is, I mean, there's nothing wrong with being digital about it, but this allows me really to get the freedom of paint, sort of abstract nature of paint, but then also have the ease of digital art, so I can, you know, still have a lot more control over what it is that I'm doing. So there you go. So that's how you would create sort of buildings. And obviously, if you have a look on different manner of ways I've used it here, you can see I've used it to create these buildings over here, even the ones in the foreground, these buildings over here as well. Created with a much larger brush, I created these buildings in a bit more of an abstract way. Created this very dense metropolis looking city with this here. And again, I've used it to create all these sort of buildings here, even the ones in the foreground, and just painted them. Now, obviously, over time, you're going to build up and add more and more layers just to create a bit more depth to each and a bit more detail to each building. But it's a really good start. Create a new layer here. My next brush I'm going to look at is the hard flat brush. So that was a soft flat brush. The next one is the hard flat brush. This is a similar brush, but you can see here it's set to color dodge. And it's a bit, if I just drag here, it's a bit harder and it's a bit more wet. So you see the other ones, it felt a little bit dry, but this one's actually a bit more wet as a brush. The reason for that is I like to use it for lights. So if I just switch over here to like a yellowish colour, it's already on colour dodge. And in fact, I'll do it as vertical first just to see what kind of effects you get. And you can see I'm just dotting around different lights here. You can actually make it smaller as well if you want. The fact that it is, in fact, all these brushes have a blending mode on them, gives you a bit more of that randomness of the effect, and it gives a bit more of a build up. So unlike with digital art, where if you just kept painting as you normally would, it would just start covering whatever's underneath it. When you have a blend mode applied to the brush, it gives you sort of a bit more of an experimental feel to it, and you start seeing things that you wouldn't have seen normally. So if you keep painting over different strokes, you start to get this kind of, in this case, like an illuminated effect. And it's actually really nice, rather than just covering over something that you've just painted and then it just disappearing forever. Because you keep adding and building up on top of it, it's actually creating a feel of real paint. But actually it's less, obviously it's less messy, but with real paint it could become quite muddy. But because it's digital, you don't actually really get that muddy look. I mean, as an example, I could just keep painting over this and it doesn't become muddy, it just becomes bright. And so that just looks like maybe just a bit more of a brighter part of the building here, which you can use. And I could do that here as well, sort of highlight this part of the building here. Just keep painting over. And so you can see how that starts to work there. You can see in the distance there. Obviously this is painted on a white background, so you probably wouldn't want it on white. You'd probably want it on a much darker background, but I'm just illustrating the point of the brush really. Okay, so you can see how we're starting to build up now. So we've got this basic shape with the soft flat brush, and then we've got the lights with the harder flat brush. Now you can obviously use them in any way you want. You could actually use this brush to create, I'll just make this a bit more grey. You could use this brush to create the building itself if you wanted that kind of look. And you can see this is still on the colour dodge mode. You can sort of create buildings just with this, and actually this might be better for the particular style you're going for. I just tend to use it the other way around. And then so here's our buildings here. This is with the hard flat, and you can see the lights are almost starting to not look like lights anymore. It's almost like sun is reflecting off it. So there's like shadow and light. And we can create a bit of depth using that as well. Obviously, you just got to be a bit careful with how you paint the buildings behind, because you don't want them to be too dark, and how you create the foreground. But that's another way of using it. And again, we've created some more shapes, and I could actually use it to create those lines here. Just create another one here. Just got to be careful because it's set to colour dodge at the moment. You can always change it. Not to overly build up on this one, because this won't become muddy, but you'll start to ruin your shadow. So if I start to paint here, for instance, that side becomes too bright, and that's might not be what I want, because it looks kind of like the light source is hitting us from this direction, but these are all in shade, so it kind of ruin that. So you just need to be a little bit careful about that. What you could do is, if you want to still keep building up on top of it, but you don't want it to keep getting bright, what I tend to do is just add another layer, and then I can paint directly on top of that to get rid of it if I've made a mistake, rather than erase it. So again, if I just sort of, I overwork this area, it's too much, it's gone too bright, just create a new layer, and then as long as the layer is set to normal, I can just paint over the top of that, and that makes it much easier to work with then. So you can see there's two different sort of approaches to the city. Very basic at the moment, but you can see how these brushes work. And for me, I create these brushes because they're really fun to use, and they're much easier for me to be able to create whatever's in my head without spending ages on the detail. And I do often now, I paint from 100%, or even from the this perspective even, so I can see the whole canvas. But I used to zoom in really close up to everything and try and add all these tiny little details here, and I'd make the brush go really, really small. But over time, I think learnt firstly that people don't really care about that kind of detail, because you're going to look at the painting from a distance like that. But secondly, it just stops it from being enjoyable for me personally. And I get too caught up in the detail and not paying attention to the whole picture. So that's kind of why I created this brush, all these brushes, and that's why I wanted to approach my art in a bit of a different way compared to my older stuff, if you notice it. Okay, so that's we've gone now through the pencil sketcher, the soft flat brush, and the hard flat brush. I'm now going to show you the angled brush. Now the angled brush, I'll show you an example of what I've used it for. I pretty much use the angled brush to create this entire self-portrait here. And I found it really useful for building up layers of skin and a bit more of that detail that I did here, as you can see, where obviously those big flat brushes are not going to work with this kind of detail. It's for much more for objects kind of in the distance, and to sort of do a lot of legwork for you without having to do a lot of detail work. But when you're doing detail like this, then you kind of need something with a bit more control, something that you got a bit more control over. And while I love the flat brushes for creating cities very quickly, it really doesn't help for adding detail to something like a portrait. And so if I just move these out the way, in fact I'll just scroll up on the canvas or scroll down the canvas here, you'll see if I start to paint with this. Now let's just choose maybe a skin tone as well. What about here? Right there. You can see, start to paint with it, how different it is as a brush. It's angled, so it's slightly an angle here, and that just makes it a sort of a nicer finish to it, rather than it being a bit too sort of straight. So I'm just going to draw a very simple outline of a head here. And you can see, as with the last one, as you build up the paint, it still looks like a paintbrush has been on here. It doesn't look like, you know, a standard brush has sort of just painted on top of it and just become like one solid block. So as an example, if I was to use this soft round brush here, let's not make it so soft, make it around about there, and choose the same color and do something similar, eventually it sort of becomes one block of color, and you can't really see the strokes, or it looks very digital, i.e. you see these edges here because I've got the opacity set here, but it becomes very digital, and then eventually as you keep painting over it, it just becomes a block of color. And I'm not really a fan of that. I'm actually looking for this more brush stroke sort of look to it, which is what I created this angled brush for, just to again have that painterly look to it. So it kind of works in that respect, and it leaves these marks and strokes around, which makes it feel like a brush has been over it. And then I can just sort of take maybe a darker shade and just add a bit of depth to it here. And you can see on my tablet I've got the size set to size adjustment set on the side, so I can actually just quickly adjust here on the side, and I can just keep using the colors to blend that. I've got the color picker set to my pen as well, so I'm just tapping the little button on the side so I can blend it in very quickly without too much effort. And you can see it leaves those kind of brush strokes on the top and bottom of it as well. So you can see if you sort of brush like that, you can see these little tips like the brush nib's gone over it. And you can see the little bristles sort of flaking off almost at the edges. So it's got that kind of effect to it, which I really like. Something if you enjoy drawing fruit or something like that as well, this would work quite well for that. So yeah, just to go back to this, you see over time I used a lot of detail and time to create these kind of shapes around this self-portrait as well, which really worked. Okay, so that is the angled brush. The next one is the primer brush. So I'm just going to select that, and I'm going to actually clear all of this stuff now. So the reason for in fact I'll just turn the layers off. The reason I use the primer brush is to, in fact, I'll just create a bit of a sort of more of a generic grey background here. The reason I use the primer brush is because, let's say I've got a colour palette. So if I go over to my swatches, I've got a bunch of different colour palettes here. And I go to green neon as an example. In fact, I'll go to Retrowave Sunset. So I want to start laying down a colour palette in the background so that I can use it to pick from it. One of the old techniques I used to use was getting loads of different images and blurring them and then sort of whacking them here, there and everywhere in the painting to sort of get a colour palette. But now what I've done, I've created these colour palettes so I can just paint them on. So I know I'm going to use sort of these as maybe the sky colour as an example. And I'll just use these to just paint over the top. And you can see I've had it set to hard light up here. So as I paint, it just sort of applies the colour down, and it actually gives me a few different variations in the brightness and the saturation as well. So I can sort of use that to lay that down and then maybe add contrasting colour towards the bottom here. And you see, because I've got it set to this sort of scatter effect, you can see it kind of, the more I hold it down and push, it sort of glows out, creating this almost like cloud-like effect. I'm just going to use maybe this darker colour towards the bottom, the darker red towards the bottom. And maybe go off to a darker purple here. Maybe a darker blue towards the bottom. And so straight away I've almost created my colour palette onto that as a background. There's also bits of sky that will bleed through as well. And again, if, like, for instance, I don't like this because it's going to keep using the hard light blending mode to build too much on top, I can just create a new layer and just sort of cover over that. But now I've got a very nice sort of base coat, if you will, just to start my painting. And so now if I go into a new layer and I use my soft flat brush, in fact let's use a hard flat brush as I did before, and I just start creating some buildings. So let's use maybe this dark blue here to create the buildings, maybe this sort of more faded look here. You can see I can start to create that on top of here, and I can actually use now colour pick the background to create a consistent colour palette throughout the image. I'm just creating these buildings, just going through, shrinking the brush as I need to. You can see it starts to build up and create this really nice skyline with very little effort. I mean, I haven't really done much here, and granted it looks very abstract, but that's kind of the point of it. If you're going for something that's got a lot more realism to it and looks a lot more realistic, then my sort of way of painting and really this brush set's not really for you. However, you want sort of this much more enjoyable freehand abstract way of creating stuff like this, and I think you'll really enjoy using these brushes. And we'll just pick this purple, create a new layer, because I think this bottom bit's a bit too much at the moment, and just create this sort of shimmering reflections here. I can actually just make the brush larger, create that. And again, I'd definitely spend longer than I've just spent here, but this is a really good sort of basis for an image for a city, which didn't really take much time at all. So straight away we've got our sky, we've got our buildings that are painted in here with the hard flat brush on this occasion. Got some reflections in the water, and we've got this sort of dark water here. In fact, I might even want to use the soft flat brush to just paint a bit of a sheen on top of the water here. You can see, because those strokes, it just gives that effect of water coming through there, which I think is adds that kind of reflective feel. I might, if I want to, actually just add a bit of white in there maybe. Let's see what that looks like. It might not work. Not sure if that works. Maybe try a blending mode on that. That doesn't work, does it? Reduce the opacity. Yeah, that brightens up a little bit. I like that. Okay, so that was really an illustration. I started using the primer brush to create that sort of basis for you, but then the other flat brushes have just created the much more detail of the city over the top. But I've used that color palette I've then created using that primer brush, and everything's just sort of come to life within a matter of minutes, really. Okay, the next brush I'm going to show you is the round tip brush. No, in fact, I'm going to show you the air dodger that I use, which is the kind of color dodge. Very, very simple airbrush, sort of soft round brush that I use. I usually create a new layer, I change it to color dodge, and I'll pick one of the sort of saturated colors in here. So maybe like this sort of pinkish color here. Make it a little bit darker. So I'll sort of pick the middle area here, and I'll just sort of brush over the top here to add a bit of a sheen and a bit of a glow to it if I need it. That might be a little bit too much, so I can just reduce the opacity. So that's without it. Just bring it in a little bit, and you can see actually that looks quite nice. What I might do is if I just add a mask to that layer, and I might just brush the top bit away. So there's kind of like a bit of a mist over here, but it's not overboard. And that just brings a little bit of glow to the image for us without, again, much effort. And finally, I'm going to show you this round tip brush. You'll see the brush actually paints like that. So it's kind of these broad strokes. So let's say I might want to add maybe some of these hills in the background. Or maybe a bit more here. I think that's maybe not misty enough, really, is it? Let's try here. So there's kind of mountains that live in the background here. A bit of shade to these. Probably a little bit too bright there. Too saturated, should I say. There. So I'm just going to add an airbrush dodger here just to sort of make this area glow a little bit. So it looks a bit misty towards the bottom here. Might use this kind of colour here, so it's a bit mistier. Let's turn that into a colour dodge layer. Lower the opacity a little bit. And there you go. There's a painting all done and dusted. Like I said, I would add a bit more detail to this over time. I might add a bit more features to the landscape, and maybe something in the foreground or something to look at. But for the most part, I'm pretty pleased with that. Okay, so thank you for watching, guys. Hopefully you found that helpful. If you've used the brushes and you've had some experience with it, please let me know what you think. Is there any improvements you'd like me to make to them, or any additional brushes you might think are worth adding to it? Then let me know, and I'll see if I can add them in. Other than that, thanks very much, guys, and I'll speak to you soon.